The salt-laden wind tousled Nemo Fisher's hair as he stood at the bow of his weathered fishing vessel, the Mariner's Hope. The early morning light painted the horizon in strokes of amber and gold, promising another day of both challenge and solace on the open waters. At 42, the lines etching his sun-bronzed face told stories of years spent battling the unpredictable moods of the sea, a life that had shaped him into a man of few words but profound depth. Nemo's calloused hands gripped the railing as the boat cut through the waves, heading toward his favorite fishing grounds. The familiar weight of solitude settled over him, a companion he had grown accustomed to since inheriting the boat from his father almost 2 decades ago. The sea had been his most constant relationship, more reliable than any he had managed to forge on land-perfect conditions. Today, he murmured to himself, breathing deeply of the briny air that had become more familiar than the scent of his modest coastal homes. His weathered blue eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the subtle signs that would guide him to today's catch: the slight change in the water's color, the pattern of seabirds overhead. The radio crackled to life, breaking the morning's tranquility. Mariner's Hope. This is Harbor Masters. Do you copy? The voice belonged to Elias Grant, who had managed the small fishing harbor for as long as Nemo could remember. I copy, Elias. What's on your mind this early? Nemo responded, reaching for the radio. Just checking in. And to remind you, we've got that marine biologist team arriving today. They'll need someone to take them out to the reef later this week. Thought of you right away. Nemo frowned slightly. He preferred the predictable rhythm of his solitary fishing routines, the quiet companionship of the sea and skies. Playing tour guide to scientists wasn't his idea of a good use of time. Can't Miller or Santiago take them? I've got traps to check all week. They specifically requested someone who knows the eastern reefs. That's your territory, Fishers. Besides, they're paying good money. Might help with those engine repairs you've been putting off. Nemo sighed, knowing Elias was right. The Mariner's Hope had been making concerning noises for weeks now, and parts weren't cheap finds. When do they need me? Thursday morning, 7 a.m. sharp. Their lead researcher is arriving today to get set up. Name's Daniel Thorne, from the Coastal Marine Institute. Something about the name stirred a distant memory, but Nemo couldn't place it. Right. I'll be there, thanks, Fisher. Happy fishing today. Harbor Master out. As the radio fell silent, Nemo returned his attention to the sea, pushing thoughts of Thursday's commitment aside. Today belonged to him and the water, the reliable dance he had perfected over decades. By mid-afternoon, the Mariner's Hope was laden with a respectable catch. Nemo worked methodically, cleaning and storing the fish in ice-filled containers. The familiar rhythm of the work allowed his mind to wander, drifting back to his youth when fishing had been an adventure rather than a livelihood. He had been just 19 when his father suffered the stroke that ended his fishing days, thrusting young Nemo into the role of captain and provider. The weight of that responsibility had shaped him, hardened him in some ways, but the sea had also become his sanctuary, the one place where expectations were simple: work hard, know the water, survive its moods. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Nemo turned the boat homeward. The harbor came into view gradually, a collection of weathered docks, seafood processing buildings, and the small-town charm of Port Havens. It wasn't much, but it was home in a way nowhere else had ever been. Nemo expertly guided the vessel into its berth, securing the lines with practiced efficiency. The familiar sounds of the harbor seagulls crying overhead, fishermen calling to one another, the gentle creaking of boats against their moorings enveloped him as he began unloading his catch. Good day out there. The question came from Marco, the elderly man who had run the dockside fish market for as long as anyone could remember. Decent enough, Nemo replied, hefting a container of fresh catch onto the docks. Sea bass are running strong, Marco nodded approvingly. Always reliable you are. Unlike these younger fellows who come back with tails instead of fish. Nemo managed a small smile as he continued unloading. Marco's praise meant something. The old man had been his father's friend and had watched Nemo grow from a boy who struggled to lift a single fish to the capable fisherman he was today. Heard you're taking up those science types on Thursday, Marco commented, helping Nemo with the last of the containers. News travels fast. Small harbor. Big ears, Marco chuckled. Might be good for you, some company for a change, Nemo grunted noncommittally. His reputation as a loner was well established in Port Haven, and he preferred it that way. Fewer complications, fewer expectations, fewer disappointments. As they finished the unloading, Nemo noticed an unfamiliar figure standing at the harbor master's office, tall, with dark hair caught in the breeze, wearing clothes that marked him clearly as an outsider: khaki pants, too clean for dock work, and a navy jacket better suited to a university campus than a working harbor. "The your scientist," Marco said, following Nemo's gaze. "Arrived on the afternoon ferry. Been asking questions about the eastern reefs all afternoon." Something about the man's stance, the way he gestured as he spoke with Elias, tugged at Nemo's memory again. Before he could place it, the stranger turned, and their eyes met across the dock. Recognition flickered across the man's face, followed by a hesitant smile and a raised hand in greetings. Nemo froze, the past suddenly crashing into the present with the force of a rogue wave. Daniel Thorns, not just any marine biologist, but Danny, his closest childhood friend, his first real heartbreak, and the person who had left Port Haven 15 years ago with promises to return that had never materialized, Nemo Fisher. I can hardly believe it. Daniel's voice was deeper than Nemo remembered, but it carried the same warmth that had once made Nemo feel like the most important person in any room. They stood awkwardly outside the harbor master's office, 15 years of absence stretching between them like an uncrossable channel. Danny Nemo nodded, acutely aware of the rough edges he had accumulated, the weathered skin, the calloused hands, the clothes perpetually imbued with the scent of fish and salt. Daniel, by contrast, looked like he had stepped out of a different world. Academia had clearly treated him well. You looked exactly as you should, Daniel said, his eyes taking in Nemo's appearance with what seemed like genuine appreciation. The sea suits you, and you look like a professor, Nemo replied, unsure if it was a compliment or an observation. Daniel laughed, the sound surprisingly unchanged by times, because I am one, technically. Associate Professor of Marine Biology at the Coastal Institute, Elias glanced between them, curiosity evident. You two know each other, we grew up together, Daniel explained. Nemo and I used to explore these very waters in his father's old rowboats, pretending we were great oceanographers discovering new species until you actually became one, Nemo said, the words coming out more wistfully than he had intended. An uncomfortable silence followed, filled with unspoken histories. Elias, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. Well, I'll leave you two to catch up. Doctors. Thorn, Nemo here will be taking you and your team out to the eastern reefs on Thursday. No better guide in these waters. After Elias departed, Daniel turned to Nemo with a tentative smile. I was hoping it might be you. When they mentioned the most experienced guide for the eastern reefs, I wondered, why are you here, Danny? Nemo asked, cutting through the pleasantries. 15 years is a long time for a research trip. Daniel's expression sobered. The research is legitimate. We're studying the impact of changing water temperatures on the reef ecosystem. He paused, then added more quietly, but I requested this specific location. I've been following your father's old charts, the ones we used to study together. Nemo felt a complex wave of emotions, anger at the long absence, a surprising flicker of pleasure that Daniel remembered those days, and beneath it all, the dull ache of what might have been. I need to secure my boat for the night, he said finally. I'm willing to navigate this conversation on the public dock, of course. Daniel nodded. But maybe we could talk later. I'm staying at the Harbor View Inn. Perhaps dinner. The invitation hung in the air between them. Nemo hesitated, all too aware of how easily he could fall back into orbit around Daniel Thorne's charismatic gravity. It had been that way since they were boys, Danny with his boundless curiosity and ambitious dreams, Nemo content to follow in his wake, anchored by family obligations and a deeper connection to the local waters. I've got early preparations tomorrow, Nemo hedged. Disappointment flickered across Daniel's face, but he recovered quickly. Another time, then. I'm here for 2 weeks, Nemo nodded and turned away, feeling Daniel's eyes on his back as he returned to the mariner's hopes. The familiar tasks of securing his vessel for the night offered little comfort against the tide of memories that Daniel's unexpected return had unleashed. That night, in his small harborside home, Nemo found sleep elusive. He lay awake, listening to the distant sound of waves against the shore and remembering a summer 15 years ago, when everything had seemed possible. They had been 27 then, Nemo, already established as a fisherman, having taken over his father's business completely, and Daniel finishing his doctorate in marine biology. Daniel had returned to Port Haven for the summer, ostensibly to gather data for his dissertation, but they had both known he had come back from Emo. Those months had been transformative. What had begun as childhood friendship had deepened into something profound, stolen moments on the boat under star-filled skies, conversations that lasted until dawn, and a connection that had made Nemo believe, for the first time, that his life could expand beyond the confines of Port Haven's harbor. But summer's end had brought reality crashing down. Daniel had received a prestigious research opportunity that would take him across the world, studying coral reefs in distant oceans. He had asked Nemo to come with him. We could see it all together, Daniel had said, eyes alight with possibilities. You know the sea better than anyone I've ever met. We'd make an incredible team, but Nemo's father had been declining then, needing more care. The business was the family-only incomes. Port Haven was the only home he had ever known. The idea of stepping into Daniel's world of academia and research had terrified him more than the fiercest storm at sea. I can't just leave, he had said that night on the docks. This is my life, Daniel had nodded, his disappointment palpable but his understanding genuine. I'll come back, he had promised. Once I've established myself. We'll figure it out. Letters had come at first, then emails, gradually growing less frequent as their lives diverged. Nemo had watched his father decline and eventually pass, had weathered economic downturns that threatened the fishing industry, had built his reputation as one of the harbor's most reliable captains, and somewhere along the way he had stopped expecting Daniel to return. Until now. Dawn found Nemo on the deck of the Mariner's Hope, performing routine maintenance that could have waited but gave his hands purpose. The harbor was quiet at this hour, most fishermen still at home preparing for the day ahead. Permission to come aboard, the familiar voice startled him. Daniel stood on the dock, holding 2 paper cups that steamed in the cool morning air. Peace offering, Daniel said, holding up one of the cups. Still take it. Black Nemo hesitated, then nodded, extending a hand to help Daniel onto the boat. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nonetheless sent a jolt of awareness through Nemo's weathered defenses. Couldn't sleep, Daniel explained, settling on a crate opposite Nemo. Jet lags. Saw your lights on from my window. They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, the familiar yet strange presence of each other both comforting and unsettling. She's beautiful, Daniel said finally, gesturing to the boat around them. Your father would be proud, she aged, but she's sturdy, Nemo replied, running a hand along the worn railings. Like most of us, I suppose, Daniel smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way they hadn't 15 years ago. I followed your work, you know. The sustainable fishing practices you've implemented here. Your articles in the fishery journals. Surprise must have shown on Nemo's face because Daniel continued. Did you think I wouldn't notice? And Fisher Alternative Approach to Lobster Conservation was required reading in one of my courses last year. A flush of unexpected pleasure warmed Nemo's cheeks. His practical approaches to conservation had garnered some attention in recent years, but he had never imagined Daniel might have been aware of them. It's just common sense, he demurred. If we don't protect the breeding grounds, we won't have anything to catch in a decade. It's more than that, Daniel insisted. It's the perfect blend of practical experience and ecological understandings. That's why I wanted. He stopped abruptly. One of what Daniel took a deep breath. One reason I requested this research location was to offer you a position. The Institute is establishing a fisheries conservation department. We need someone with both theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Someone who understands both the science and the economic realities facing fishing communities. Nemo stared at him, coffee forgotten in his hand. You came back to offer me a job, partly, Daniel admitted, but also because 15 years is too long to let misunderstanding and distance define what we could have been. He met Nemo's gaze steadily. I never should have stayed away so long. At first I thought I was giving you space, respecting your choice to stay. Then it just became easier to focus on work than to face what I'd left behind. The honesty in Daniel's voice broke through something in Nemo's carefully constructed solitude. I waited, he said quietly. For 3 years I checked the mail every day. Then Dad got worse, and the fishing regulations changed, and survival became the priority. He paused, looking out at the harbor that had shaped his entire existence. Eventually I stopped looking backward, and now, Daniel asked, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Before Nemo could answer, the harbor began stirring to lifelights appearing in boat cabins, the distant sound of engines starting, the day work beginning regardless of personal revelations occurring on the deck of the Mariner's Hope. I need to prepare for today's outing, Nemo said, rising from his seat. Thursday, 7 a.m. I'll take you and your team wherever you need to go, Daniel nodded, understanding the conversation had reached its limit for now. As he prepared to disembark, he turned back. For what it's worth, Nemo, I never stopped thinking about you. Not during a single sunset over any ocean I've studied. The words lingered in the salt-laden air long after Daniel had disappeared down the dock. The next 2 days passed in a blur of routine for Nemo. He took the Mariner's Hope out to his usual grounds, checked his traps, and delivered his catch to the market. If he was more distracted than usual, nobody mentioned it. On Wednesday evening, as he was preparing his vessel for the next day's scientific expedition, Marco appeared on the dock with a package. Your science friend asked me to deliver this, the old man said, handing over a waterproof bag. Said it might help with tomorrow's outing. Inside, Nemo found detailed maps of the eastern reefs, annotated with coordinates and notes in Daniel's familiar handwriting, along with a letter. Nemo, these are the specific areas we're interested in studying. I've marked them based on what I remember from your father's charts, but I trust your knowledge more than any map. The team is excited to work with someone who knows these waters intimately. I want you to know that whatever happens between us, whether you accept the position at the Institute or choose to stay in Port Haven, value your expertise and respect your connection to this place. See you at dawn." Daniel's professionalism of the note was almost disappointing after their candid exchange on the boat, but Nemo appreciated the clarity it provided for tomorrow's works. This was a job, nothing more. He could handle that. Thursday morning dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for reef observations. Nemo arrived at the dock early, performing his pre-journey checks with methodical care. The Mariner's Hope needed to be at her best today. Daniel arrived punctually at 6:45 a.m., accompanied by 3 younger researchers laden with equipment. He introduced them briefly: Maya, the team photographer, and coral specialist Thomas, who focused on water chemistry, and Ling, whose expertise was in fish populations. "Everyone, this is Captain Fisher," Daniel said formally. "We're fortunate to have his expertise today. These waters have been his workplace for over 20 years. The respect in Daniel's voice was evident, and Nemo found himself standing a little straighter as he welcomed the team aboard and outlined safety procedures. Once they were underway, a curious transformation occurred. Daniel, whom Nemo had always known as confident and commanding, deferred completely to Nemo authority on the waters. When Maya suggested a different route to the first site, Daniel shook his head. "Captain Fisher knows these currents. If he says this is the best approach, then it is." The simple statement of trust affected Nemo deeply. As they approached the first reef site, he found himself sharing more than just navigational information, pointing out how the reef had changed over the decades, which fish populations had declined or flourished, the subtle changes in water clarity that concerned him. The research team listened intently, Daniel taking notes and occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he remembered details from their youth observations they had made together during those formative explorations. By midday, the initial awkwardness had given way to a comfortable working rhythm. While the researchers dove in pairs to collect samples and data, Nemo maintained position above, keeping a watchful eye on changing conditions. Daniel surfaced from one dive to find Nemo tracking a distant weather pattern with concern. "Problem?" he asked, pulling himself back aboard. "Storm system moving faster than forecast," Nemo replied, pointing to clouds gathering on the horizon. "We should finish up here soon." "I don't like the look of those formations," Daniel nodded without questions. "I'll tell the others." "How much time do we have?" "An hour, safely. Then we need to be heading back." The efficiency with which Daniel reorganized the research priorities showed his expertise in his own domains. Within minutes, the team had adjusted their plan, focusing on the most essential measurements and samples. As Thomas and Ling completed the final dive, Daniel stood beside Nemo at the helm. "You still read the weather better than any meteorological equipment," he observed. "Had more practice," Nemo replied simply. "It's more than that. You have an intuition for the sea that can't be taught." The compliment warmed Nemo unexpectedly. "Like your intuition for marine ecosystems," Daniel smiled. "Maybe that's why we worked well together, even as kids." Complementary knowledge. As the last researchers climbed aboard and the equipment was secured, Nemo turned the Mariner's Hope toward harbor, increasing speed as the distant clouds darkened ominously. The boat cut through increasingly choppy waters, spray occasionally washing over the bow. The younger researchers looked nervous as the ride grew rougher, but Daniel remained calm, helping secure loose items and checking that everyone had their safety vests properly fastened. "Trust the captain," he told his team. "There's no one better to navigate us through this." The storm hit with surprising intensity about halfway back to Port Haven. Ream lashed the deck, and waves crashed against the hull. Nemo's focus narrowed to the essential task of keeping the vessel steady through the turbulence, his hands firm on the controls, making minute adjustments based on decades of experience. Through it all, he was acutely aware of Daniel's presence beside him, not interfering but offering quiet support, handing him the radio when needed, checking the navigation system, relaying information to the worried research team hovered in the covered section. They worked in wordless coordination, as if the 15-year gap in the deck. They felt now a force more expansive than it had momentally expected. Though they had much to do with Daniel pre-designation, the team would then head out. "Your expertise made all the difference today, just doing my job," Nemo replied, though they both knew it had been more than that. As the younger researchers disembarked, Daniel lingered. "Would you join us for dinner tonight? The team wants to properly thank you, and we could use your insights as we begin processing today's findings." Nemo hesitated, then nodded. After facing the storm together, declining seemed impossible. "What time?" "7, at the Harborview restaurant. I'll be there." Dinner proved surprisingly enjoyable. The young researchers were genuinely interested in Nemo's observations about changes in the reef over time, and he found himself drawn into technical discussions about water temperature variations and fish migration patterns that engaged his practical knowledge in ways simple fishing rarely did. Throughout the evening, he caught Daniel watching him with an expression that mingled professional appreciation and something more personal, a look that caused Nemo's earlier dear. During the evening, however, little news been received. Some of them forgot himself at their meal and a bottle of wine, using the dry silence they had devoted themselves to keeping the meal and a bottle of wine. Was distant, but they lack what you have, that lifetime of observations. The data we collected today is valuable, but your insights about how the reef has changed over decades. That's irreplaceable, Nemo shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just paying attention. Anyone would notice after 20 years, no, they wouldn't, Daniel insisted. Most people see what they expect to see. You observe what's actually there. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's why the Institute needs someone like you. Someone who bridges the gap between academic research and practical application. The job offer again. Nemo turned his wine glass slowly, watching the liquid catch the light. I have responsibilities here. What kind? Daniel asked gently. Your father's gone. You've mentored younger fishermen who could take over your routes. The Mariner's Hope could use a refit which the Institute's salary would easily cover. He paused. What's really holding you here, Nemo? The question struck at the heart of something Nemo had avoided examining too closely. What did keep him tethered to Port Haven? Habits? Fear of change? Or something deeper, a connection to the waters that had shaped him? A sense of belonging. He feared losing this, as my home, he said finally. These waters, this community. I understand who I am here. Daniel nodded slowly. I respect that. But consider this, the position would require regular returns to Port Haven. Seasonal research, ongoing monitorings. It wouldn't mean abandoning your home, just expanding your territory. The notion settled over Nemo like a net, constraining yet somehow full of possibilities. Before he could respond, Daniel continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. 15 years ago, I asked you to leave everything for my dreams. That was selfish, and I've regretted it. He met Nemo vs directly. This time, I'm offering a way for our worlds to coexist. For the expertise we both value in each other to create something meaningful. The sincerity in Daniel's eyes made it impossible for Nemo to dismiss the idea outright. I need time to think, he said finally. Of course. The position won't be officially announced for another month. Daniel hesitated, then added, but I hope you'll consider it. Not just for the Institute's sake, or for the reefs we both care about, but for us. For what might still be possible. The acknowledgement of that unfinished personal business hung between them, neither able to retreat from it any longer. The remaining days of the research expedition established a new rhythm. Each morning Nemo would guide the team to different sections of the reefs. He found himself increasingly engaged in their work, offering observations that the researchers eagerly incorporated into their studies. In the evenings he often joined them for dinner, the conversation flowing between scientific discussion and personal stories. Nemo discovered that Daniel had never married, had dedicated himself to his work with the same passion he remembered from their youth. The knowledge stirred something within him, not quite hope, but a kind of wondering about paths not taken. On the final day of the expedition, they visited the farthest eastern section of the reef, a spot that held particular significance for both Nemo and Daniel. It was here, in their teenage years, that they had discovered a rare species of nudibranch not previously documented in local waters. The discovery had cemented Daniel's desire to pursue marine biology and had given Nemo his first glimpse of the joy in scientific observation. As the team conducted their final measurements, Daniel and Nemo found themselves alone on the deck, looking out over waters burnished gold by the late afternoon sun. Do you remember the day we found it? Daniel asked, his voice soft with nostalgia. The blue-spotted nudibranch. Nemo nodded. You were so excited you nearly capsized the rowboat. Daniel laughed. And you were the one who knew exactly how to mark the location so we could find it again to show my biology teacher. We made a good team. Neiman replied, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. We still do, Daniel replied. Today proved that again. The moment stretched between them, 15 years of separate lives somehow compressed into insignificance by the familiar waters surrounding them. The position at the Institute. Nemo began hesitantly. Would I need to? He struggled to articulate his concerns. You wouldn't need to change who you are, Daniel finished for him. That's the last thing Ned wants. Your connection to these waters, your practical approach, that's what makes your perspective valuable. Nemo nodded slowly, his resistance beginning to crumble under the weight of possibilities. And us? What would we be to each other? The directness of the question seemed to catch Daniel by surprise. For a moment his academic polish fell away, revealing the same earnest young man who had once asked Nemo to follow him across oceans. Whatever you want us to be, he answered simply. Colleagues, certainly. Friends, I hope. He paused, then added with quiet conviction. More than that. If you're willing to give us another chance. Before Nemo could respond, the research team surfaced from their final dive, calling out excitedly about their findings. The moment of intimacy dissolved as they returned to their roles, captain and researcher, guiding the expedition safely back to harbor. That evening, as the research team prepared to depart the next morning, Nemo stood alone on the deck of the Mariner's Hope, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The familiar harbor lights began to twinkle on, reflections dancing across the gently rippling water. Footsteps on the dock announced Daniel's approach. He carried 2 bottles of beer and offered one silently to Nemo, who accepted with a nod of thanks. They stood side by side, watching darkness claim the waters that had shaped both their lives, albeit in different ways. I leave tomorrow, Daniel said finally. The team has enough data to begin the formal assessment. I'll need to present preliminary findings next week, Nemo nodded, aware of a growing sense of urgency, decisions that needed to be made, words that needed to be spoken before another 15 years could pass. I've been thinking about your offer, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning within him. The position at the Institute. Daniel turned to face him, expression carefully neutral. And I can't leave Port Haven entirely, Nemo began. This harbor, these waters, they're part of who I am. I understand that now, Daniel replied softly. I didn't 15 years ago. But I do now, but Nemo continued. I've been thinking about what you said. Without expanding my territory, he took a deep breath. If the position could accommodate seasonal returns to Port Haven, allow me to maintain my connection here while contributing to the research. I'd like to consider it. Hope brightened Daniel's features. It could absolutely be structured that way. In fact, maintaining your fishing operation here would provide valuable longitudinal data for our studies. Nemo smiled at the academic terminology. You always could make the practical sound scientific, and you always could make science practical, Daniel countered, his smile warm in the gathering darkness. They fell silent again, the possibility of a shared future suddenly tangible between them. Nemo found himself remembering all the moments over the years when he had wished for Daniel's perspective on something he'd observed in the waters, all the discoveries that had felt incomplete without someone to share them with. There's something else we need to address, he said finally. If we're going to work together, Daniel nodded. Waiting 15 years ago, we were more than friends, Nemo stated simply. If that's going to complicate this professional arrangement, we should acknowledge it now. The directness seemed to both surprise and please Daniel. Always straight to the heart of things, he murmured. Yes, we were more than friends. And yes, that history will inevitably influence our professional relationship, he hesitated, then added. But I believe it will strengthen rather than hinder our work. How so? Because beneath all the scientific terminology and fishing expertise, there's a fundamental trust between us. A mutual respect that even 15 years of separation couldn't erase. I saw it during the storm, how we worked together without eating words. Nemo couldn't deny the truth of this observation. Even at their most estranged, something essential had remained unbroken between them, a connection forged in their youth and tempered by the separate paths they had traveled, and the personal aspect, Nemo pressed, needing clarity. What are your expectations there? Daniel set his bottle down on the deck railing and turned fully toward Nemo. In the dim light from the harbor, his expression was open, vulnerable in a way that the accomplished professor rarely allowed himself to be. My expectation is that we begin again, he said quietly. Not as the young men we were, with unrealistic dreams and uncompromising demands of each other, but as the men we've become, with an understanding of what matters, what can be compromised, and what cannot. The simplicity of the answer resonated deeply with Nemo. No grandiose promises, no dramatic declarations, just an honest acknowledgement of the possibility that still existed between them, tempered by the wisdom of years and separate journeys. I think I can work with that, he said finally, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rare smile. Daniel's answering smile held 15 years of waiting. Slowly, giving Nemo every chance to pull away, he reached out and placed his hand over Nemo's where it rested on the railings. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the contact both familiar and entirely new. The harbor lights reflected in the water below, celestial points mirrored in the darkness, as 2 lives that had diverged began the careful process of reconnecting like tides drawn inevitably back to shore, regardless of how far they had traveled. In the months that followed, Nemo's life transformed in ways he was not a contributor. In the months that followed, Nemo's life transformed in ways he would never have anticipated. The Mariner's Hope received its long-needed refit, while Nemo divided his time between Port Haven and the Coastal Institute. His practical knowledge, combined with access to scientific resources, led to innovations in sustainable fishing practices that benefited both the academic community and the working harbor. The transition wasn't without challenges. Nemo struggled initially with academic protocols and formal presentations, while Daniel had to learn the rhythms of harbor life and the practical constraints facing fishing communities. But what might have been insurmountable obstacles 15 years earlier became opportunities for growth, each man expanding his understanding through the other's perspective. And in the quiet moments, evenings on the deck of the refurbished Mariner's Hope, mornings in Daniel's light-filled coastal apartment, they rebuilt what had been lost between them. Not the headlong passion of youth, but something deeper and more enduring, a partnership, forged through separation and reunion, through professional respect and personal understanding. The sea remained Nemo's first and most enduring love, the constant presence that had shaped his life and identities. But now that love was enhanced rather than diminished by sharing it with someone who valued both the waters and the man who had been formed by them. As for Daniel, he found in Nuno's steady presence an anchor he had never known. He needed a connection to place and practical reality that gave his research new meaning and purpose. Together, they navigated the confluence of their separate journeys, like two currents meeting to form something stronger and more purposeful than either could have been alone. And in that joining, both found a home more expansive than either had imagined possible, one that encompassed both the familiar harbor of Port Haven and the broader horizons beyond, bound together by tides that had always been drawing them back to each other.